the House where they're not properly distanced. Could they please not be there? Thank you. We now come to the statement by the Home Secretary. Priti Patel.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to make a statement on public order. Like all members of this House, I was sickened at George Floyd's tragic death. His treatment at the hands of the United States Police was appalling and speaks to the sense of injustice experienced by minority communities around the world. I fully appreciate the strength of feeling over his senseless killing and the inequality that black people can sadly still face and the deep-seated desire for change. I know that it is that sense of injustice that has driven people to take to the UK streets to protest. This government is clear that racism and discrimination in any form have no place in our society, and we will do whatever is required to eradicate it. Of course, there is more we can do. There is more that we should all do to combat inequalities across society, to support those seeking social justice, better life chances, and offer hope where all too often, too many are confronted by despair. And it is right in any democracy, in an open and free society, that we advance these issues in a constructive, sensitive, and a responsible way. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government understands the importance of the right to protest. In normal circumstances, a large and peaceful protest would not be of concern to the authorities, because we do live in a great country where our right to protest and our right to have our voices heard is integral to our fundamental democratic freedoms. The right to come together and express our views peacefully remains one of the cornerstones of our great democracy. Members across this House share an enduring commitment to uphold liberty and freedom of expression, but under the basis of respecting the rule of law. But as our nation battles coronavirus, these are not normal circumstances. So to protect us all and to stop the spread of this deadly disease, any large gatherings of people are currently unlawful. We cannot afford to forget that we are still in the grip of an unprecedented national health emergency that has tragically claimed over 40,000 lives. So the severe public health risk forces me to continue to urge the public not to attend future protests. The government's scientific and medically led advice remains clear and consistent. No matter how important the cause, protesting in large numbers at this exceptional time is illegal, and doing so puts everyone's lives at risk. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn to an operational update. Around 200 protests took place across the country over the weekend, attended by over 100,000 people. As many as 137,500 people have now attended Black Lives Matter's protests across the UK. While the majority were peaceful, a lawless minority of protesters have regrettably turned to violence. The worst violence flared in London on Saturday evening, with missiles and flares being thrown at police officers outside Downing Street. Officers in protective equipment were deployed to arrest the culprits and to clear the area. At least 35 officers have now been injured during the protests in the capital. I salute their bravery and wish them a swift recovery. The thugs and criminals responsible are already being brought to justice. This is a fluid situation, Madam Deputy Speaker, but as of this morning, the total number of arrests stood at 135. As the ugly tally of officer assault shows, Madam Deputy Speaker, some protesters regrettably turned to violent and abusive behaviour at the weekend. This hooliganism is utterly indefensible. There is no justification for it. There is no excuse for pelting flares at brave officers, throwing bikes at police horses, attempting to disrespect the cenotaph, or vandalising the statue of Winston Churchill, one of the greatest protectors of our freedoms who has ever lived. It is not for mobs to tear down statues and cause criminal damage in our streets, and it is not acceptable for thugs to racially abuse black police officers for doing their jobs. The criminals responsible for these unlawful and reckless acts are betraying the very cause that they purport to serve. These protests are about injustice, but by attacking our courageous police, they are acting in a wholly unjust way. When I became Home Secretary, I vowed to back the police. I said that I would stand with the brave men and women of our police and security services and against the criminals. And I stand by that today, proudly and without apology. Because as we saw at the weekend, we ask our frontline police officers to do the most difficult of jobs, to run towards danger, to ensure that we are not in danger, to put their own lives on the line to protect the public, to uphold the rule of law and the rights of individuals against the disorder that we have seen in recent days. By doing this, the police in our country give us all the very security we need to live our lives as we choose. That is an essential part of our freedom. Because violence, disorder and crime, it blights communities and society as a whole. So the police need to know that they have a Prime Minister, a Home Secretary and a government that stands with them, and that we will give them the tools and powers and the resources they need to keep us safe. And they do. Police funding has had its biggest uplift in a decade, increasing by over £1 billion. And we are recruiting an additional 20,000 police officers to keep our streets and our country safe. They all have my full support in upholding the rule of law and in tackling violence, vandalism and disorderly criminal behaviour. And I could not be clearer that I want to see the violent minority responsible arrested and brought to justice. Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with the many peaceful protesters that racism has absolutely no place in our society. Black lives matter, but police brutality in the United States is no excuse for the violence against our brave police officers at home. So to the quiet, law-abiding majority who are appalled by this violence and have continued to live their lives within the rules, I hear you. To the police who have been subject to the most dreadful abuse, you have my full backing as you act proportionately, fairly and courageously to maintain law and order. And to the criminal minority who have subverted this cause with their thuggery, I simply say this: your behaviour is shameful and you will face justice. I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you. Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Home Secretary for her statement and for advance sight of it. Like everyone in the House, I was appalled by the killing of George Floyd. His fateful words, "I can't breathe," not only haunt us, but have also been a catalyst for people across America and the world to say that the racism that continues to shame everyday life must stop. People in our communities with lived experiences and family legacies of the prejudice black people in the United Kingdom face have bravely stepped forward. And I want to be absolutely clear, I hear you. And not that it should need saying, but Black Lives Matter. Words are important, but we cannot allow this moment of global demand for justice to pass without action. And we on these benches will be at the forefront of calls for change. What is never the solution, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, is violence and vandalism. The vast majority of protesters are peaceful, but some of the actions we have seen from a minority are unacceptable. I condemn those who have attacked the police, and I want to pay tribute to the police officers putting themselves in harm's way over the weekend, and I hope the Home Secretary will update us on the condition of the 27 officers injured, including one in hospital and the injured protester. When it comes to the statue of Edward Colston, I do not condone an act of criminal damage to remove it, but I will not miss a public statue of a slave trader, and it should have been taken down many years ago. At a time when politicians and public health experts are rightly stressing the need for caution around protests given the risk of coronavirus, and I stress that again today, and the importance of social distancing, the imperative on those in power is all the greater to show that they have listened, that they understand the scale of the anger and the desire for meaningful action. At moments like this, it is for our leaders to unite communities, heal divisions and confront the injustices in our society. Public Health England recently published their report on the disparities in the risk and outcomes of COVID-19, showing that black males are 4 times higher than expected to die with COVID-19. The recommendations of that report need to be made public now. Coronavirus has shone a light on inequalities that have long existed. The damning findings of the Wendy Williams Windrush Review need to be heeded and its recommendations acted upon. The Home Secretary said earlier today she was looking at them, but she needs to come to the House and tell us the action she is taking urgently. My right honourable friend, the member for Tottenham, produced a report in September 2017 on the treatment of and outcomes for black, Asian and minority ethnic people from first point of contact with the police and then throughout the criminal justice system, showing that black people make up around 3% of the general population, but accounted for 12% of adult prisoners and more than 20% of children in custody. These shameful statistics matter, and the government should implement the report's recommendations in full. In recent days, we have heard powerful testimonies from so many people on how racism continues to impact daily lives in our country. Doesn't the Home Secretary agree with me that now is not the moment for divisive rhetoric? Instead, this is a time for the government to listen, to learn and to act.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his thoughtful comments and his considered response both to my statement but also to the appalling events that we have seen, the violence in particular. And he is absolutely right in his comment about the processes around the removal of the statue and the violence that was associated with it. We live in an open society and in a democracy. We have the means and the mechanisms to bring statues down and to change the society in the way in which we wish to. But he's absolutely right, and I recognise the point that he makes about peaceful protest. It remains an absolutely important part of society and the way in which we have our voices heard, the way in which we can come together to combat the inequalities across society, but also to give service to those communities that sometimes feel that they have no voice, and find ways in which we can bring together the aspects that can help to change lives, to bring social justice together, rather than causing divisiveness in the way in which has been alluded to. But I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is also important to say, and the Right Honourable Gentleman refers to a number of points, some of which were aired earlier on during oral questions. When it comes to the Windrush Review, I could not have been clearer. I will return to this House, of this dispatch box, to talk about the recommendations within the context of inequality, but also within the context of many of the criticisms that were levelled at the Home Office over a substantive period of time. And it is right that we do that. But also the Right Honourable Gentleman speaks specifically about health inequalities and life chances and the lack of opportunities, particularly for the black community, violence, but also the criminal justice system as well. These are issues that we have to tackle together to understand many of the root causes, the societal causes, but importantly, provide the right solutions and the right support to the community across the country as well. And I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may also just echo the words that the Honourable Gentleman has made around our police officers in particular. Those injured officers that sustained the most appalling injuries, having spoken to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner this morning, I've heard from her that the officers are recovering. They have sustained some awful, horrendous injuries, including a punctured lung and a broken collarbone, with a particular officer where the bike was thrown at the horse. That is thoroughly unacceptable, and I wish all the officers a swift and good recovery. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is exactly the type of behaviour we never want to see again on our streets. And our police continue, when it comes to coronavirus, to operate by consent, by ensuring that they have community engagement. That is at the heart of policing by consent in the United Kingdom. They have the support of the communities within which they operate. They work with the organisers. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, my final point is, with the protests that we saw over the weekend, the police and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner was absolutely clear about this. There were no community organisers to engage with. And I made the plea on Saturday as well, and I urged all the community organisers behind the protest to engage with the police so that people could protest safely, to prevent the spread of the virus, but also to prevent violence and disorder from taking place. Sadly, that did not happen. And going forward, we must work together collectively to prevent acts of violence and thuggery in the way in which you saw at the weekend, and ensure that people that do want to have their voices heard can find the right ways of doing this without necessarily coming to the streets and protesting.
Bilma Fulani.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that the best way to ensure that Black Lives Matter is peaceful protest, working on ways to improve social justice and improve economic opportunities for black people and other ethnic minorities, not lawless, senseless violence of a small minority, defacing war memorials, public monuments, because that can undermine the whole message and indeed the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and there is no doubt when it comes to inequalities and the injustice that has been shown and felt throughout the black community in particular, that first of all, racism, discrimination in any form and shape have no place in our country and society at all. That's why, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's important that we work collectively to address the issues, address the issues of injustice, social justice, to secure social justice for the particular communities in question, to combat inequalities across all society, but importantly, increase life chances, opportunity and hope, and that is something that we should all be united on.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. In the first place, I want to extend my best wishes for a full recovery to all the police officers who suffered injury during the trouble in London and to pay tribute to their brave service. I also want to unreservedly condemn the violence and disorder that took place. However, it's very important that we don't let a minority distract us from the legitimate concerns of the Black Lives Matter movement. The desire to take to the streets to protest is understandable, and across this House, one thing we share, I hope, is a cherishing of freedom of speech, freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, and the right to protest peacefully is a fundamental part of these rights. However, we are in the midst of a public health crisis, and having regard to that, the Justice Secretary in Scotland, Humza Yousaf, joined with prominent anti-racism activists to urge people in Scotland to plan protests against racial injustice in a way that safeguarded them and the wider public from the ongoing threat from COVID-19. Protests went ahead in Glasgow and Edinburgh, but they were peaceful, I'm pleased to say, and I know that the organisers and participants tried very hard to maintain social distancing. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that it's really important that we don't let the minority who engaged in violent disorder detract from the legitimacy of the concerns of the protesters and the Black Lives Matter movement? Does she also agree with me that it's very important that all in public life are careful not to do or say anything that might polarise the situation, as Trump has done in America? And finally, will she use this opportunity to make a clear commitment to review all government policies where there is evidence that they impact adversely on BAME communities, such as the no recourse to public fund policy, to which I referred to earlier this afternoon, evidence that shows that it clearly does discriminate against BAME communities? And will she also commit not just to bring back the Windrush report to this House, but commit to implement the recommendations of that lessons learned report. Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her remarks, for her support for the police officers, but also respecting the right to protest in a safe and sensible and proportionate way as we are in this public health emergency. I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important to labour the point that these protests are about injustice. And it is right that we come together to find the right way collectively to tackle the injustices, to fight for social justice and deliver social justice for Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities. But as we've seen on our streets, by attacking our courageous police, individuals and a small minority have been acting in a wholly unjust way. The Honourable Lady mentioned the events in America, and of course it's dreadful. It is utterly heart-wrenching and sad to see the level of protests that we see there as well. And of course, as we've seen over the weekend, it is a small minority that are subverting the cause with which people are protesting about. And we continue, obviously, to fight to solve inequalities and injustices. The Honourable Lady has already spoken. She raised earlier on the policy issue of no recourse to public funds. She's also mentioned the Wendy Williams review and report. She's mentioned the health inequalities as well, particularly for Black communities and minority ethnic communities. It is right, as the government has addressed in this House previously last week, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we collectively come together, and the Equalities Minister is looking at this right now, in terms of the overall approach, in terms of combined policies, not just one policy, but the integral policy approach across government in terms of how we can serve these communities better, but also address many of the inequalities that have been brought to light over recent weeks.
Thank you. We now go virtually to Hendon. Dr. Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all agree that there is injustice in the world, but does the Home Secretary agree with many of my constituents that viewing images of demonstrators throwing bikes at police officers, aiming fireworks at horses, and racially abusing other people is simply unacceptable? The irony is that public sector workers were recently being applauded, and now those very same people are being put at physical harm, both through violence and a pandemic. Will the Home Secretary agree to undertake every possible step, including the cooperation and agreement of the Mayor of London, to prevent any further demonstrations during this period of pandemic?
Secretary.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's made some very, very important points. First of all, in terms of the violence that we witnessed on the streets, the assaults on police officers, I've already made my views abundantly clear as to how unacceptable the violence and the assaults are. The Honourable Member will know, and all members understand, that when it comes to operational decisions, when it comes to policing, they are very much the operational independence of Chief Constables, the Commissioner in London in particular, and also the responsibility that Police and Crime Commissioners have for the totality of policing in their force area. When it comes to future protests, it is the responsibility of the Mayor of London to ensure that policing, but also protests in particular, do not manifest in the way in which they have done. He has a duty as well to communicate to Londoners, to express their own views in a right and proportionate way by sticking to the regulations that have been outlined by government already. I myself made views very clear over the weekend, as did the Secretary of State for Health, that we do not want to see these protests take place. We are in the midst of a health pandemic. By doing so, by gathering in this way, people's lives are being put at risk. That is not helping anybody. That is not going to stop the spread of the virus. That is not going to protect the NHS. So the Mayor of London has a very, very important role to play right now, and I would urge him to step up and do exactly that.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join first with the front benches, all the front benches, in sending support and best wishes to all the police officers who have been injured, and also by their strong sense that violence by a minority is always unacceptable and helps no one too. There is a responsibility on all of us to ensure this does not prevent us from coming together to respond to the strong demands for action against racism and injustice across the country. And in that spirit, the Home Secretary will know that the Home Affairs Select Committee is conducting our inquiry into policing 2 decades on from the Macpherson report. And next week we will be looking at reports that the COVID-19 enforcement fines may have been disproportionately applied to BME communities. Can I ask her whether she has looked at that and what she has found, and also whether she will provide for the Select Committee a list of all of the practical steps she and the Home Office are now taking to tackle injustice and racism?
I thank my right honourable friend for her questions, but also for the work that she is doing on this matter with the Home Affairs Select Committee. I will absolutely provide the Select Committee with the information she's asked for, and I look forward to working with her to outline the practical steps and measures, particularly around FPNs throughout the coronavirus crisis, but also look at enforcement issues and work with her to address many of the issues 20 years on since the Macpherson report when it comes to policing issues. And I know from all the conversations that I've had with the Met Police Commissioner over not just recent days, but over several months now, when it comes to diversifying London's police force, but all our police forces, making sure that we do everything within our power to work to address cultural issues, improve training, do more when it comes to recruitment, but also ensuring that all officers across the country and in London as well understand that they serve the communities in which they serve and they police, but they understand the communities of which they are members of too.
The House is grateful to the Home Secretary for taking the trouble to answer in great detail all of the questions that have so far been asked. But now that we've had quite a few questions asked, we'll have to speed up a bit to try and get everyone. I know I make no criticism. These are very sensitive matters and they need to be dealt with in full. But perhaps now we can go rather faster. Robin Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to say that in North Wales the protests passed off peacefully over the weekend. Does the Home Secretary agree that we have a tradition of effective, peaceful protest in this country? And can she reassure us that those who perpetrated acts of violence and criminal damage over the weekend will be brought to justice?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He is absolutely right, and I give my thanks to his local police force and to the officers that policed the protests at the weekend. He's absolutely right. We want to ensure that swift justice occurs, which sends a very clear message out to the individuals, the perpetrators of serious violence, and we do not want to see a repeat of that again.
Florence Eshelome.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Vandalism and violence should never be accepted, and I also want to pay tribute to the hard-working officers who've been on the front line, including officers from my borough of Lambeth, who are often the first to be called when there's any protest because of our location to central London. But does the Home Secretary actually understand the anger and frustration felt by so many people? Does the Home Secretary recognise that this protest has been led by young people? Does the Home Secretary recognise that there's structural inequality, discrimination and racism in our country? Does the Home Secretary recognise that people want to see action from this government? My son turned 3 yesterday. I do not want to have to wait until he's a teenager before we see changes in this country. Will the Home Secretary and this government act now? Black Lives Matter, and we need to see this government doing something about that.
Yeah.
I'd say to the Honourable Lady, I'd make a number of points actually. I've been very clear in my remarks about the level of injustice that is felt across the country, and that's been illustrated in what we've seen over the weekend and the very peaceful protests that have taken place. But I'm really saddened that the Honourable Lady has effectively said that this government doesn't understand racial inequality. Well, on that basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, it must have been a very different Home Secretary who, as a child, was frequently called a packie in the playground. A very different Home Secretary who was racially abused in the streets, or even advised to drop her surname and use her husband's in order to advance her career. A different Home Secretary recently characterised, if Madam Deputy Speaker I can say so, in the Guardian newspaper as a fat cow with a ring through its nose. Something that was not only racist but offensive, both culturally and religiously. This is hardly an example of respect, equality, tolerance or fairness. So when it comes to racism, sexism, tolerance or social justice, I will not take lectures from the other side of the House. I have already said repeatedly, there is no place for racism in our country or in society. And sadly, too many people are too willing, too casually, to dismiss the contributions of those who don't necessarily conform to preconceived views or ideas about how ethnic minorities should behave or think. This, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my view, is racist in itself. And as I said earlier on, both in my statement and in my answers to other colleagues in the House, to combat the real inequalities in society and to end the gross disservice to many communities, Madam Deputy Speaker, across our nation who are subject to real and pressing inequalities, we must address these issues. These are sensitive issues in an accurate and a responsible way by addressing prejudice rather than inciting and inflaming tensions.
Kevin Holland-Reid.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was going to say how very good it is to hear this House so united, but I think in the main it is in its support for peaceful protest, particularly one that's tackling prejudice and unfairness, but also its support for the police. Would my right honourable friend agree that the best way to support the police now is to deter future violent crime by making sure everybody who is guilty of things like throwing missiles at police, on those videos that we've all seen, that video footage is studied, those people are arrested, charged and prosecuted?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. And there should be no doubt, absolutely no doubt whatsoever, that swift justice will follow. And that is exactly what the British public want to see. They want to see the rule of law applied, but also for people to express their views in a peaceful way that is in line with the democratic values of our country.
Clive Efford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I just want to add my voice to those who've condemned the minority of people at the weekend who were acting in a violent way towards the police, and I wish them, those injured officers, a speedy recovery. But, Secretary of State, doesn't it just fuel the suspicion of people from the BAME community when the recommendations of something like the Public Health England report are withheld? Aren't they bound to suspect that that's the establishment feeling that they're likely to be embarrassed and made to feel awkward by those recommendations, and shouldn't they be published?
Well, I'd say to the honourable gentleman, first of all, he's speaking to a Home Secretary who's from the BME community, so there is no withholding of the data or information that he is referring to. The government has been fully committed, and the Equalities Minister is working to not just look at the data, but importantly work across government, and I think this House needs to fully recognise this, to work across government through all government departments from a policy perspective to understand the causes, whether they're health issues, housing issues, understand the range of issues that basically dominate many inequalities. And it's important that the government has the time and space to do that and actually delivers the right solutions to provide the right levels of social justice.
And we now go to Midlothian, to Owen Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Midlothian and in Edinburgh, there are streets, a statue and other local references to Henry Dundas, but there's no mention in any of these locations of his shameful role in delaying the abolition of slavery, which forced around 630,000 slaves to wait for more than a decade for their freedom. Does the Home Secretary agree with leading human rights activist Professor Sir Geoff Palmer that we cannot erase parts of history, but that more honest narrative is needed about memorialised figures in the slave trade as a crucial step in our journey to becoming a fair and inclusive society?
In response to the honourable gentleman's question, the approach for becoming and being a fair and inclusive society also applies to the democratic ways in which we can express our views around cultural monuments, around statues, around street names. And it is right that whether it's a statue or any type of memorial, that people work through the right processes, the democratic processes with local authorities and with the right individuals to achieve the change that people want to see.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Fortunately, my Cleethorpes constituency has had a low infection rate from COVID, but in recent weeks people have been anxious about an influx of visitors to the resort. You can imagine, Home Secretary, that they're doubly anxious this coming week because they...
I'm trying not to interrupt people because we don't have very much time, but we must make sure that we adhere to the standards of this place. The Honourable Gentleman knows, as indeed the previous Honourable Gentleman got wrong, you cannot address the Home Secretary as Home Secretary. You must address the Chair. There are still new members here who don't quite know how to do this. There are good reasons for it that we don't have to go into now. There are good reasons for it. The Honourable Gentleman must address the Chair.
My apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend will be aware that my residents are doubly anxious at the moment because a Black Lives Matters protest meeting is planned for this coming Saturday. Could my right honourable friend assure me that they can be reassured that not only will their property and people be defended, but social distancing will be enforced to maintain the low infection rate?
Well, my friend makes a very, very important point, which is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may reiterate the point that I made earlier on, we ask protest organisers to engage with the police. That way, anybody that wishes to express their views or opinion in the right way, in a socially distanced way as well, can do so, and in a legitimate way, to see the type of things we saw over the weekend with mass protests, crowds coming together, with more or 6 people, obviously not socially distancing. We are in the midst of a health pandemic, and it's right that we undertake, all of us, responsibly, and communicate that message across all our communities that social distancing matters, it can and will save lives, and importantly, that we continue to control this virus at this very, very delicate time.
Faye Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend, the member for East Surrey, quoted Martin Luther King on social media this morning when she said, in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. Yeah. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the violence seen over the weekend undermines the essential message of Black Lives Matter, which must be heard?
And, you know, I've made this point repeatedly, how the violence dominated what was the majority of peaceful protests and subverted the very clear message where people were making their voices heard to articulate the injustices that they see. And, of course, there is no scope for violence, and that should not be tolerated.
David Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that nobody reasonable could ever conclude that acts of thuggery by police officers on the streets of Minneapolis could ever justify acts of thuggery against police officers on the streets of London? And will she do everything in her power to ensure that there is no repetition of the events of last weekend?
My friend is absolutely right, and I've spoken about the violence, the disorder and the criminality that was witnessed on the streets of London this weekend. I will absolutely continue to work with chief constables and police and crime commissioners across the country, as will my honourable friend, the policing minister, to make that point again and again. While we support the right to protest, we are in a health emergency, it is right that we protect the public, but it's also right that our police forces uphold the rule of law.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The violence that we saw at the weekend was simply wrong. That's straightforward. However, would the Home Secretary agree that we should look at what President Trump's doing in America and do the exact opposite? And instead of encouraging bitterness and anger and even violence, which is what he's doing on a daily basis, we should be showing leadership, bringing people together and opposing racism everywhere.
These protests are about injustice. And what we've seen in America is dreadful, absolutely awful to see America tear itself apart. But as I have said repeatedly now, we can come together to address issues across all BAME communities, to address inequalities and the issues of young people and their life chances and the fact that they want more hope and opportunity. And that is the type of leadership the United Kingdom can show.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Residents in Stoke-on-Trent, Kidsgrove and Torque were rightly outraged when they saw the cenotaph graffitied and our Union Jack attempted to be burnt, desecrating the memories of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms today. Will my right honourable friend back me in supporting Lewis Fielder and the Conservative Friends of the Armed Forces by introducing a Desecration of War Memorials Bill to enable our police and courts to more easily prosecute those who damage our sacred memorials.
I completely support the sentiment and the point that my honourable friend has just made.
Christine Jardine.
Deputy Speaker, none of us in this place or anywhere in the country, I believe, wants to see violence and vandalism on the street. None of us wanted to see a large gathering of people at a time when social distancing is so vital for public health. But more than that, none of us wanted to see the mindless violence against our police officers. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, would the Home Secretary not agree with me that the answer to that is not to ramp up the rhetoric and to throw more police officers into the fray? It's to look at the systemic injustice that there is in this country, to invest in social programmes, to invest in tackling that. I would not suggest for a minute that the Home Secretary does not understand racism, but I would ask her to rethink the government's strategy in dealing with the injustice that we have in society today.
Madam Deputy Speaker, first of all, when it comes to policing, our police continue to operate by consent, and they command the respect and cooperation of the British people by acting with integrity and accountability. And if I may say so, they do that in an outstanding way. When it comes to addressing social injustice and inequalities, as I have said repeatedly this afternoon, it is right that we come together as a government, and in fact, as a House, all honourable and right honourable members have a duty as well to their own communities to be part of the solution in addressing the injustices, and that is something that we can all collectively work to achieve.
Now, I must implore honourable members, a lot of people have bothered to come here this afternoon, and they're not all going to get to ask a question because most honourable members have not asked questions. They've made statements and told stories. From now on, we'll have to have short questions, and that's one question each, and then the Home Secretary will be able to give short answers to one question. Robert Courts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very much trying to do that. We are lucky to live in this country under the protection of the rule of law, not least because of the actions of Winston Churchill, who defended the rule of law and defended this country against industrialised racism. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that under the rule of law, violence and vandalism has no place?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Black Lives Matter protests have been held across Wales, and I too stand against the injustice and violence faced by black people here and elsewhere. Now, the vast majority of protesters respected social distancing, or they made innovative use of communications technology. Will the Home Secretary give due credit to the peaceful majority? For example, school student Sophia Matchnick-Thomas...
We don't need examples. The question has been asked. Order! The question has been asked, Home Secretary.
The Honourable Lady is right that we should absolutely reflect upon those, the majority, that have protested peacefully. And the young people, I would commend the young people in particular, whether it's through online protests, which, quite frankly, Madam Deputy Speaker, are much safer when it comes to the health endemic that we are enduring right now. But importantly, the voices of those that have protested peacefully has effectively been subverted through the violence that we saw this weekend.
Tom Hunt.
Deputy Speaker, I will just very quickly say how appalled I was at the damage to the Winston Churchill Monument on the 76th anniversary of D-Day. Absolutely appalled, and my constituents. They are ignorant fools who did that, and they should be properly held to account. I would say we have a big job to get the balance right between respectful, peaceful process, but also preventing criminal damage and preventing mass disruption. Does my right honourable friend think we've got the balance right at the moment, and do the police have the powers they need to get that balance right? Thank you very much.
Deputy Speaker, the important point to make and to note is that for those that participated in violence and thuggery, justice will follow, and the police have all the powers and all the tools necessary to ensure that happens.
We now go to Rotherground for Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I share the Home Secretary's condemnation of anyone who engages in acts of violence, yet there remain valid concerns about the exporting of riot gear tear gas and rubber bullets to the US, where some police forces have engaged in brutal crackdowns against peaceful protesters, will she join calls to her colleagues in the Department for International Trade to immediately suspend export licences for this equipment to the US?
The Honourable Lady will know that the government as a whole considers all export applications thoroughly against a strict risk assessment, and all exports to the United States are conducted in line with strict guidance, and the United Kingdom operates one of the most robust licensing regimes in the world.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for reassuring the country that the individuals who desecrated the cenotaph, Winston Churchill's statue and the statue of Abraham Lincoln will be held to account? And does she agree that vandalising monuments to the heroes who defeated fascism, defended our freedoms and ended slavery in the United States does absolutely nothing to further the cause of equality?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and those acts of violence were wholly counterproductive, utterly counterproductive, and that is why it's important that justice follows and the police pursue those individuals that are responsible for those crimes.
We now go to Glasgow. Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's important to recognise that the majority of the weekend's protests, including those in Glasgow and Edinburgh, were peaceful. But to show that black lives really matter, we must examine the deeds of the past. So will the Home Secretary now commit to removing statues of slave traders from public places of honour?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right to point to peaceful protests. That is part of the vital part of a democratic society. But she's asked about the removal of statues of particular individuals. There are processes, and the Honourable Lady will know this, democratic processes that should be followed and should be respected by everybody to bring about that change, including working with councils of all colours across the country, Labour councils, Conservative councils, Lib Dem councils, and that due process is followed. And that is absolutely the right approach to take, including following the rule of law.
Richard Holden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Throughout the pandemic, our police officers have put themselves in danger to uphold the rule of law, save lives and serve our communities. Does my right honourable friend join me in condemning the actions of violent agitators over the weekend, who've not only put our brave police officers at risk, but whose actions have taken away from the reasonable, careful and important voice of lawful demonstrators?
Just before the Home Secretary answers that question, could everyone who has still got to speak please just take their pen through their introductory remarks and ask a question? Please, it's not really very difficult. Just cut out the first bit. Home Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We'll try again. Will the Home Secretary agree with me that the government should remove statues of British figures involved in the slave trade? Further, will she agree with me that the lives of black people who have died following contact with police, like Sarah Reid and Rashan Charles, are worth more than any statue?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady will be well aware, and perhaps she would like to lobby local authorities across the country to bring about the changes to statues. And I noticed the Honourable Lady celebrated the violence and criminal scenes that we saw across the weekend. I thought the politics of protest and placards had left the Labour Party with the departure of the Right Honourable Member for Islington North.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud that it was a Conservative government that introduced Finn's Law to protect our service animals. Will my right honourable friend assure me she will not rest until the minority of thugs involved in attacking the police horse, as well as, of course, of our brave officers, are brought to justice?
My friend is absolutely right, and what we witnessed at the weekend was utterly despicable. I look forward to visiting the mounted police horse section quite soon. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I've had it with authority from the Metropolitan Police Commissioner that the injuries, obviously, to the horse were mild, but importantly, she highlighted yet again how the acts of thuggery are disproportionate, not just to police officers, but to the animals as well.
Sarah Sultan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Edward Colston made his fortune violently transporting 84,000 Africans to the Caribbean. At least 19,000 died en route. Statues of racist murderers like Colston can be found in cities across Britain. So I asked the Home Secretary a simple question. Does she believe it is right that black Britons have to walk in the shadows of statues glorifying people who enslaved and murdered their ancestors? Yes or no?
The Honourable Lady will join me in lobbying Labour councils across the country where they've been in charge for many, many years to bring about the change that black, Asian, ethnic minority people would like to see.
Laura Trotz. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that we must not let the violence of a minority this weekend overshadow the majority who were peacefully protesting, and that we must bring forward practical steps to address the remaining racial inequality in our society?
My friend is absolutely right, which is why the government is working with the Equalities Minister across government to address many of these issues around social injustice that need to be tackled.
We now go to Dunfermline, to Douglas Chapman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many Elizabethan British heroes used violence to enhance their wealth. Would the Home Secretary agree with me that violence is never part of the solution, but if we can educate our citizens in where we've been, what we've done, and to whom, that provides the basis for an equal and humane society?
My friend makes a valid point. Violent activity can never be regarded as a legitimate form of protest. And I expect those who engage in violent activity not just to face the full force of the law, but importantly, make sure that those that have a legitimate voice, that their voice is heard through the right means.
Shelbrook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In regard to public order, can I ask my right honourable friend to continue the policies of stop and search and get knives off the street, which not just Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the most extraordinary...
Order! Home Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the important facts about stop and search, which I've experienced myself when it comes to meeting the parents of young black men who have been murdered on the streets of London, is the significance of stop and search when it comes to taking weaponry off our streets. And I think it is important for all members of this House to recognise, and when I've seen those parents and when I've sat with them and heard of their stories, they themselves call for more stop and search to stop more young black lives being killed and to prevent more criminal and violent activities on the streets of our cities.
Chiomwara.
Thank you. Says that there is no place for racism or discrimination in our society. But there is. It is everywhere. It is crushing the hopes and lives of millions in this country. I condemn the violence and the vandalism, but the vast majority of the protests were peaceful, and I want to hear from the Home Secretary what she's actually going to do to eradicate the racism she condemns so that we do not need to have more protests in 5, 10 and 15 years.
The important point to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not down to one individual. We all have a responsibility. Yes, and we all have a responsibility across government, across this House, across society to understand the inequalities and the extent of injustices. And from a government perspective, that means coming together, finding the right policy solutions, which of course this government is committed to doing.
Deanna Davison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking County Durham residents for maintaining both peace and social distancing at the protests in Durham this weekend? Yeah. And will she also join me in calling for all of those who acted lawlessly and violently against our police to face the full weight of the law as quickly as possible?
That's absolutely right, and I'd like to congratulate her constabulary for the work that they have done, and the Chief Constable, who I have spoken to recently. But importantly, those acts of violence are not acceptable, and it's right that people are absolutely, they face the full force of the law.
We now go to Aberdeen, Kirsty Blackman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, no recourse to public funds is a policy that is in place at the Home Office and disproportionately affects my black constituents. So is the refusal rate of visitor visas. Will the Home Secretary commit to looking at these structurally racist policies within the Home Office and to reforming them so they do not disproportionately affect my black constituents?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I refer the Honourable Lady to my comments on this issue earlier on.
Lucy Allen.
Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend has offered her full support to our police in tackling violence, vandalism and disorderly behaviour. Will she encourage the Mayor of London to follow her lead?
My friend is absolutely right, and it is the responsibility of the elected Mayor of London, the Police and Crime Commissioner for London, to do exactly that.
We're a Hob House.
Thank you. Many people in Bath, Bristol and the surrounding areas have said the statue of Edward Colston should have been removed many years ago. Does she agree?
So the question is, why wasn't it, and why did the Labour Mayor not do that sooner?
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, will the Home Secretary join with me in paying tribute to the fortitude, professionalism and patience of our police forces in the face of yet more unnecessary aggression and violence?
Our police officers and our police forces have shown great courage over and throughout the weekend and during these protests, and I absolutely stand with them and support them as they have faced a criminal minority with the dreadful approach that they have taken and shown.
Tracy Braben.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My inbox, like many's, is full of emails from constituents demanding we decry racism and police brutality, and I absolutely applaud that. One such constituent, Zora, second-generation British Indian, chartered accountant and mum of 3 children, asks me, according to Inquest, the proportion of BAME deaths in custody where restraint is a feature is twice as many as other deaths in custody. To build trust with communities, what can the Secretary of State tell us government is doing to end this injustice?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's important to understand the facts and figures around deaths in police custody. In 2018-19, there were 16 deaths in custody, of whom 15 individuals were from a white background and 1 was black. It is important that obviously the IOPC looks at all investigations in the right way and holds to account police forces when deaths in police custodies take place, and that is exactly what happens.
Jerome Mayhew.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is the dehumanising of the other that makes it okay violently to attack a stranger, whether that stranger be black or white. Does my right honourable friend agree that we should listen to the peaceful voices of the BAME communities, but we should also celebrate our civilian, unarmed police who look after us all and celebrate our common humanity?
My honourable friend is absolutely right in celebrating our common humanity, but also the diversity of our great country and the people that have taken to the streets and expressed their views in a balanced and proportionate and peaceful way. And when it comes to our police, I absolutely stand with them. They've shown great courage and determination over the weekend.
Patrick Grady.
Deputy Speaker, we'll overlook the irony of the Home Secretary saying mass gatherings are unlawful while hundreds of us are required to gather here in Westminster. I wonder if she believes that the hostile immigration environment, indefinite detention, no recourse to public funds and destitution and no family reunion for unaccompanied minors sends a message that Black Lives Matter to this government.
I've been very clear about the protests over the weekend, and also how this government and how all of us as members of Parliament should look to work together to address issues of social injustice.
Laura Farris.
Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend has quite properly said that residents should lobby local authorities to raise principled objections to offensive statues, but Bristolians have lamented the inconsistent response of the local authority. Would my right honourable friend consider publishing guidance not to determine outcomes, but to create uniform principles so that law-abiding citizens objecting to statues can feel sure that their complaints are heard?
My honourable friend makes a valid and important point, but if people want to see change when it comes to their local authorities and also to their police and crime commissioners, they can do that through the democratic way, which is through the ballot box.
Hold on, come and talk to me. That's all right. Lillian Greenwood.
Speaker, will she congratulate both Nottinghamshire Police and the Nottingham protest organisers on their efforts to ensure that yesterday's event was peaceful and safe, and particularly the young protesters who stopped and set about cleaning up graffiti they witnessed on Nottingham's Council House? And will she tell us whether the government has raised its concerns through official channels about the shocking and divisive reaction from the President and United States authorities to peaceful protest there?
Peaceful protest remains a vital part of our democratic society, as the Honourable Lady has said, and it is terrible what we've witnessed over the weekend. But again, we speak about community spirit, the communities coming together when it comes to understanding the strength of feeling and protesting or expressing their views in the right kind of way. I've already spoken about the United States of America, and it is a tragedy in terms of what we're seeing over there.
Alexander Starford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will my right honourable friend agree with me that we should push the harshest of possible sentences for the perpetrators of the violence, not only for the violence caused, but also undermining the key message of equality and also for helping spread the coronavirus?
I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important that as we saw post the 2011 riots, that we see swift justice. We have a process of swift justice in place to make sure justice is served for the appalling acts that we've seen over the weekend.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Watching on the television, it seemed to me the police were holding back. They'll be holding back for good operational reasons, like they didn't want too many people hurt. But could I ask my right honourable friend to assure me that the police have every power they need to cope with future riots like they had to go through last Saturday?
My friend is absolutely right. He will know of the operational independence of our police forces, and obviously PCCs have the responsibility for the totality of policing within their force areas. When it comes to resource and support of our police officers, I'm unequivocal. We've given the police the highest funding uplift in over a decade. We are equipping them and training them so that they are equipped at the highest levels and standards, and that, of course, will continue.
We now go to Glasgow to Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The use of rubber bullets in the UK is thankfully rare, but not so in the US, and it's been identified that they have a 15% rate of permanent disability and a 3% fatality rate. Can she assure me that they will not be used here? And if they won't be used here, will she end their export to the US?
I've just been reliably told by the Policing Minister that they're not authorised for use in the mainland.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a Bristol MP, I want to commend the way the police handled things yesterday. It was a very difficult situation for them. Does the Home Secretary agree we need to look at the underlying reasons for people going out on the streets to protest yesterday and accept that austerity and COVID-19 and many other issues are factors behind that?
I think there are a number of issues here in terms of the question from the Honourable Lady. First of all, I have spoken to the Chief Constable for Avon and Somerset. So I've had, and the Policing Minister and I have had a considerable debrief in terms of what happened yesterday. In terms of protest, I've already spoken about the right to protest in a peaceful, lawful and respectful manner. What we witnessed yesterday was mob rule, which is completely out of kilter with the rule of law and unacceptable.
Gary Sandbrook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The protests in Birmingham last week were very peaceful, but unfortunately the same can't be said for the weekend's protests in London. And so does she agree with me that there is never any excuse for thuggish and violent behaviour against our police officers?
My friend is absolutely right.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Look, I congratulate many of the peaceful protesters and the police and authorities that have helped facilitate those protests, acknowledging that the UK still is a racist country for many people. But the Home Secretary is eager to comment on operational matters, but stays quiet when, of course, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, encouraged lots of sunbathers, predominantly white, to mass gather on the beaches of Brighton. Is it only white sunbathers that are the problem? Or is it only black protesters that are the problem and not white sunbathers? Will the Home Secretary ensure that messages are coherent on this issue? And will she speak out?
Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government's position on coronavirus could not be any clearer. It is coherent. The honourable gentleman should understand that the message in terms of saving lives, staying alert and
Secretary.
And not participating in mass gatherings of 6 more people is dangerous to public health. That message, I have made that point today. In fact, the Health Secretary was in the chamber prior to this statement, echoing very much those points as well. I say to the honourable gentleman, we are in a public health emergency. It's down to all of us, whether as local MPs, councillors or citizens in our community, to make sure that we all uphold those standards, as the majority of the public have done, so that we can save lives and protect the NHS.
Brian.
Everyone has the right to peaceful, lawful protest, but in a pandemic they do not. Whatever the cause, have the right to act in a way which could impact on others who choose to not hit the streets in a mass gathering. So does the Home Secretary take the view that as well as ministers pleading with the public to stay away on health grounds, police forces should warn those organising such events that they are organising what are currently illegal gatherings?
Absolutely right. This comes back to the point that I made earlier on. Many of the organisers behind these protests are not engaging with the police. Police forces around the country have worked incredibly hard over the last 10 and 11 weeks to get that message out there by engaging within their communities, and that is something that they will continue to do.
Natalie Elphick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the risk that these protests may cause a second wave of this virus and the disgraceful violence and destruction that we have seen, does the Home Secretary agree that it's time to give the police greater powers to control demonstrations and marches, where police commanders believe there is serious risk to public health, public order and to property?
This weekend has shown, Madam Deputy Speaker, that these protests are a threat to public health. And on those grounds alone, our police officers are working night and day across the country to reiterate that point and communicate that message. My final comment is that the operational independence of chief constables is recognised in law, and of course the 2011 Act gives police and crime commissioners responsibility for policing within their forces, and it's important that they reiterate many of these important and essential messages.
Thank you, and I thank the honourable members who took part in the second half of that statement for being swift, and therefore we were able, within just over an hour, to allow everybody who wanted to participate to do so, and that's a fair and decent way of doing things. Thank you very much. In order to allow